Hey everyone, it's Steph here to show off the new Material Layers feature in Toolbag 5. In this video, I'll go over how material layers can be used to apply complex materials to meshes with or without UV data, or to use them for texturing large meshes like height map terrain. Now, you might be asking, why use material layers when I can just use a texture project? While texture projects are amazing, material layers can be useful in a few interesting ways. Material layers let you use world space or UV tiling to achieve the right textile density independently on each material layer. This means higher fidelity textures that aren't restricted to a model's texture resolution. Another benefit is adding complex material detail to meshes with no UV data, as you can just throw on some vertex colors and then set each layer to triplanar projection, enhancing the material depth. Lastly, with material layers, you can use UV sets to add specific details to models. Say you have a symmetrical character with body and arms, but want to add a tattoo on one arm. You can use an additional UV set to isolate the left arm and add a tattoo to just that arm without duplicating it on the other. These are just a few examples of the power of material layering. In this guide, I'll walk through a few of the different modes and show you when and how to use each one for creating environment assets and beyond. So let's have a look at this wonderful landscape scene made by Sergio and Joe from the Marmoset team. As I zoom into this cottage, let's talk about what a material layer is while showing off this concrete wall material. Material layering is a special setting you can enable in the material editor, which allows material properties to be layered on top of the base material. Each of the layers can be masked to blend with the layers under it to make a more complex material setup than what a normal material is capable of. Let me show you how this works by creating a new layered material now. I'll condense this material viewer to the list view for easier navigation. Now I'll hit the New Material button. With my new material selected, I'll just single click it to name this as Demo ML and drag this onto the roof. Rolling down to the settings, I'll head to this grayed out layers section at the top of the material here, and where it says none, I can click that and choose one of 3 layer masking types: mask, vertex color, or height. Let's choose vertex color for this one, as the roof here is set up with vertex colors and UVs ready for texturing. If I open the layers setting, you can see the interface is now enabled to start adding new material layers, with a base layer at the beginning of our layer list and an Add Material Layer button under it. First, let's have a look at the base layer, which has this home icon to the left of it. Think of the base layer as a master node of our material. I'll turn on the displacement and occlusion settings, then I can load this with texture inputs by dragging a material in from the library. Let me open the library and dock it in at the bottom. Then, from this window, I can find a corrugated iron texture to use. I'll just drag that onto the base layer's material ball icon in the layers panel. I can also convert an existing material to a layered one if I have a base material ready to go by double-clicking a material in the library to load it into the scene and then setting it to use layered materials. As foretold, all texture inputs have been filled with the data from the library's material. Now, to add to this clean material, I'll layer another material on top of it by clicking the Add Material Layer button, and I'll drag on this rust material onto the layer icon to apply this material to the layer. I'll scroll down and show you how this looks like a normal material settings panel, but with a catch. It's got fewer settings than the base node. For example, I can't add a new texture input that the base layer does not have. Let's explore this a little by heading to the base layer and disabling the albedo input. Clicking back on the material layer above it, the albedo is now disabled. That means I'm unable to add an albedo texture input to any layers above it. So it's super important to know that if you want to add a new input texture, make sure it's enabled in the base layer. This also goes for the input type. Say if you wanted to change the input type of the transmission from subsurface scattering to refraction, I could only change that in the base layer. This is important because you can't just slap a new material layer on and hope to add a little bit of subsurface shading on top of your refraction base. You will have to choose one or the other. And if you do need both, then it's the classic add and apply a separate material on a material ID or geometry. As I switch back to the material layer I added, the same drop-down for transmission will only have blend modes available, and it's the same across each of the other inputs. Just like in a texture project, I can use overlay to blend this normal map with the input maps under it. It's not just a simple on-off layering we have here. Along with masking, there are all these other ways to utilize layering, as I'll show soon. Next, I will touch on how to preview your vertex colors on a mesh. While there is no direct way to enable vertex color debug mode in the viewport, there is a way to view vertex colors by creating a debug material using the albedo mode vertex color. So, I'll make a new material and name it BC debug. Then set the albedo mode to vertex color. I'll drag this onto the roof now, and then we should be able to see how the vertex colors will look. Simple as. But what if I wanted to view what each separate channel looks like? I'll need to set up something a little more complex. I'll change the albedo color on this material back to the default albedo, and then set this material up as a layered material with 4 layers, setting each one to a different RGBA vertex color and coloring them to match. So, for example, the blue vertex color has a blue albedo, and then I set the masking to the blue vertex channel. Once it's all set up, I can now turn on and off the layers one by one to see how each one is individually masking to the layer under it. While I'm here, I'll drag this to the library and save it, so I have access to this in future projects. So, with all that explanation out of the way, let's grab the previous material we had and drag that onto the roof. Now I can start layering some library materials to get a new roof look going. Right off the bat, let's drag on a new roof-based material, like this terracotta tile from the material library. Now, because it's using the UV texture mapping mode, we can see our roof tile material is pointing the wrong way. So I'll adjust this to be -90 on the rotation, and I'll also bump the tiling to 2.5. Next, I'll pop down to the library and grab one of those cool lichen materials. This one should do nicely. I'll just drag it onto the material layer icon, and we can see it update. So now the material is on, I can adjust the transforms on the UV to increase the amount of tiling that it has. Next, it's time to adjust some of the blending on these maps. I'll set the displacement to overlay. That should help merge the two displacement maps together. Now, the albedo of the lichen is white lichen on a green rock surface. I want to get rid of that green base. To do that, I can use the transparency of the layer to mask out parts of this layer on the UV level instead of relying solely on the vertex color to do all the heavy lifting. To enable transparency masking, I'll have to go to the base layer and enable transparency dither. Make sure the transparency is empty and turn off albedo alpha. Then, rolling back up to the material layer, I can apply the transparency settings and add an alpha texture. To get a cheap alpha texture for now, I'll just copy the height map by right-clicking and copying the texture map. Then, down in transparency, I can paste the texture like so. Nice. It's time to add the next layer. This will be my mossy edges using the green vertex color. So I'll add a new material layer and set the material on it to moss. I'll disable the height map because it's not really giving me anything I need. Now I think I might need to tighten up these graphics on level 3 by heading up to the material layer blend settings. Here, I can adjust the brightness and contrast of the layer masking. Right, I'll tighten this fade by cranking the contrast to 2. Now, if I drop the brightness, it'll start looking pretty patchy. I can make it even more patchy by dragging a cow pattern mask into the transparency texture input. Perfect. Another cool thing I can do is right-click this layer and select duplicate. Then, on this material layer, I'll remove the alpha texture by clicking this X button. Finally, I'll put a slight dark tint on the albedo. Rolling back up to the blend sliders, I'll set these to something a bit more subtle. With this, I was able to soften the extreme juxtaposition of the light green moss on the red tile, giving the fresh moss a darker bed of older, damper moss that it's growing on, just by fiddling with the way the same vertex color layer blends. It's pretty neat, hey? Masks are my favorite thing to muck around with, and I think it's really neat to have this much control outside of a texture project. For the final blue channel, I'll set this material layer to use the Ash Coal library material, and I'll just tint it red to look like the top flashing has been rusting and flaking out over the moss, making it a mess and staining it. I'll adjust the contrast to an extreme amount to tighten up the blend a bit. I'll throw a cool licky texture mask in the alpha and then rotate the UV position to align it with the roof direction. Using the tiling and offset controls, I can adjust the placement of it too. This is much easier on a UV'd mesh, but it could totally work on a triplanar version of this Vertex blended shader too. These cliffs over here are also Vertex Color Blended material layers, but instead of needing UVs, they just use the triplanar projection method. But even so, we can still utilize a lot of the same tricks as the UV one. Let's start by explaining how triplanar works and why it's being used here. Triplanar is a texture projection type that applies textures to a model using world space coordinates. Give me a sec while I throw down a torus into the scene and whack a new material with this cool hippo in the albedo and tile it a few times. Now you can see that on the cliff, because it has no UVs, it's just black, and on the torus, it follows the UVs all the way through it. If I set the mode to triplanar, both models will have the same size texture on it, and as I rotate the mesh, the textures will stick in place. Well, until I change the bounding box of the two meshes. That's because world space projects the texture from 3 axis directions, and then tiles it inside the total bounding box of all assets the material is applied to. The best thing is that meshes don't need UVs. I can open the transform rollout here and use a fine-tune button to enable the transform tool to manipulate the triplanar projection to scale and rotate the world space's projection coordinates. It's new in Toolbag 5 to enable triplanar mapping outside of a texture project, so I'll clean up this scene here, and then I can show how the cliff material works with material layers and triplanar mapping. Ooh, but first I should see how this cliff looks with the Vertex Color debug shader, huh? Well, let me drag that on. Pretty simple, yet very effective vert colors going on here. I can turn on one by one to see how each one works. Looks like the red channel is for the ground blend, and the green is just variation. The blue looks like some kind of targeted form definition. Throwing the cliff texture back on it, I can do the same trick we used for the moss, by first enabling transparency in the base. Then, instead of duplicating the moss material, I'll hop back to our demo ML roof material. I'll go into the layers there, and right-click copy the layer settings. Then, back over to the cliff material, I will make a new material layer and paste the settings in. A lot of objects in Toolbag can copy and paste data between them, so it's a handy trick to use. I'll adjust the channel settings here first. I can now see that the triplanar scale of this layer is a bit out of whack. So I'll adjust that in the texture settings, because we can adjust each layer's triplanar projection separately. Excellent. Now we can see that the cow pattern texture that was copied over is showing nicely and adds the same type of patchy moss as we have on the roof. Now, the real strength of using triplanar materials with Vertex colors is for the high poly character art pipeline. This way, you can show off all your high poly meshes without UVs and still be able to add material complexity. Just throw on some vert colors and use triplanar projection in material layers to effectively texture the model. So heading back to the house, I can show off the other blend types with material layers, which is the mask type. The cottage walls use a really cool double mask feature and 2 UV sets, one for the mask and one for any tiling textures we may need. This method is super handy for trim sheet assets and other environment art assets that you might want to render that you couldn't do before. I know that I personally have a few buildings that use UV too, with trim sheets that were hard to view, even though I textured the whole thing in Toolbag 4. Now all I need is material layers. So let's do something fun with this wall. Right now, it's just a concrete wall. But what if we gave it a new look? Say, a burnt brick that's been rendered over with a concrete or stucco type outer shell that's kind of come off in bits? To do this, first I'll throw a brick material on the bottom material layer and adjust the size. So far so good, but you know what would be cool to see? If there were some cracks in this layer. I can do that. I can add a new material layer and disable all other texture inputs on that material layer, except for normal and displacement. I don't have to use all the texture inputs. Just disable and enable the ones you need for the look you want. There. That works pretty well. This is looking great, but let's try making a new mask for this material layer so that the bricks on the side of the building are exposed more. I can do this in Toolbag by using a texture project to paint some new ones. I'll make a new texture project and nest it in a folder called Mask Painting. Then I'll duplicate the cottage wall mesh and apply a new material to it, which I'll rename to Cottage TP. I can then link this to the texture project by dragging the material to the texture project in the scene hierarchy. Okay, now I'll hide all the other meshes in the scene to give me a clear area to work in, and now I can whip up a quick mask. I'll pop over to the texture tab so I can make an albedo fill layer set to black. I'll duplicate this and pop a black paint mask on it. I'll set the layer blend mode to add and color it pure blue. Similar to how I made the debug material, I'll duplicate this layer 3 more times. The top layer will be for the alpha channel mask. I'll use metalness here by setting its default to white. At the very bottom, I'll have my base control layer, where I will set the metalness and albedo to black. Now, I'll just pop up to the red layer really quick and paint in a new mask for the brick. Nice. Now I can export the mask texture to try it out. I'll set the export to this first albedo output only. I'll change the output from RGB to RGB plus A, and then set the alpha to use the metalness we set up. Then I can rename this and save it in the assets directory with the others. I'll hit export and switch over to my proper cottage to see how the mask looks. First up, I'll have to add a new mask by selecting the concrete material and going into the layers at the top to find the Add Mask button. Clicking this will let me add in my new color mask texture. I'll add it like so, and then select it from the drop-down on the brick material layer as Mask 3. Once it's set up, it's pretty straightforward. I could go on to add more chips to the other corner on the texture project by just going back and painting more. Once I'm happy, I can hit export to view the update on the material layers. I love using this trick to paint the masks for any model. I know it's a little tricky to set up, but once you have it set up, you can just use these settings to paint other masks too. Now that we've progressed with the cottage material layering, I can move on to the cool stuff material layers can do to texture terrain. This terrain in the scene uses a layered material that's using the texture mask layer blend mode with UV projection. So, like the cottage wall I was just working on, but instead of triplanar mapping, we use the UVs. This allows us to use a height map generated in a world building software and apply it to a terrain plane. So on our base layer, you'll see that there is a height displacement map and a terrain normal map. You can use a cool option in the displacement to generate normals from the height data if you don't have the normal data. This is super useful if the world building software by default doesn't generate the normal map for you. But be really careful, as this requires a really high detailed terrain mesh to help capture the height map effectively. As always, it's better to have one baked from the source. Speaking of more tries in this terrain plane, I think I might need some more. So let me go into the mesh object in the hierarchy and increase the subdivisions. The mesh object is nested inside the mesh file reference parent. So I'll just open that up and click on the mesh name I want to adjust. Here is a subdivision setting I can place on this mesh. Right now it's on 4. So let's increase this to 6 and get a good amount of tries in here to capture some of that height data. Now, as I turn on each of these material layers, I can inspect how each one affects the detailing of the terrain. Looks like the first layer is mud, which is the control base layer. The mask is set to none, so it covers everything. Now, as I turn on each layer, I can get a sense of how this is being built up, and the naming convention tells me there are a few masks open to be used. So I'm going to add some pebbles to mask 2's blue channel. I'll make a new material layer, and following the naming convention, I'll call this Pebbles 2B. Next, I'll add these beach pebbles grey to the material. Oh, pebbles everywhere, and large ones too. That's because we're in UV projection, so we'll just have to adjust the tiling. I'll open the tiling and set it to something crazy like 200. That's much better. Next, I'll turn down the displacement. I'll set the blend to overlay, and then I'll turn down the contrast to a really low number. Now, for helping blend the pebbles, I'll do the simple trick of taking the displacement map and pasting it into the transparency input slot. Change the input to the R channel and it should look much nicer. But it's still kind of everywhere though. That's because I haven't set the correct layer masking up. So I'll go to the layer settings and choose mask 2, and then I'll set the color channel to blue. There we go, all sitting nicely in the erosion runoff areas. Another way you can texture this is using the final example today, which is height map layer blend. This is great for quickly adding multi-materials to meshes like height map terrain, as it places each material in the layer stack at a corresponding height value on the grayscale map. Let me show you how this works by throwing a few simple materials on a new layered material. I'll call this new material terrain_height and set the layer blend mode to a height map. I'll copy the height map from the other material and place that into the height map slot at the top of the layer settings. Then I'll also enable height map displacement and drop that into the displacement slot on the base material. Let's crank this to around 0.27 and then drag the material onto the terrain. Now, I can turn on generate normals here to show how the height and mesh data can be used to calculate new normal data. Oh, while I'm here, I better turn on the transparency input as well. Okay, so our blank terrain is ready. So let's start adding layers. I'll start by adding a base layer, which is going to use a bedrock material. This is just for some undulation. As I change the layer tiling, this shows that I forgot to adjust the displacement. I'll set it to overlay and then turn the contrast right down. Smaller numbers are always better. Now you can see that the bedrock is just showing at the very top. That's because there is only 2 layers. So if you think about it like a gradient remap, there's one point at the start of the gradient, which is the base layer, and our new material layer is at the very top. So I'll adjust the layer brightness and contrast to cover the whole plane. As I add more material layers, that will add more points distributed on the gradient remap and will shift existing layers down the remap. So a good idea is to get as many layers in first before adjusting the settings. I'm not doing that here, as I'm doing this layer by layer. As I add the rest of the layers on top, you'll be able to see how each one adds slowly to the overall terrain layering, and the gravel and rocks layers slowly move down the side of the hills as more layers come in on top. After adding all the layers, I'll pop a snow right on the top. After adjusting the settings, I can use the rock material's height map under it to use it as the alpha texture input on the snow. I'll also add some alpha inputs on a few of these layers, mostly just to break up the blending between each. A final adjustment to tweak the color tint on some of the layers, and I think it's all done. Pretty neat, huh? It's definitely done the job, though I defo think for the top tier terrain, this mask option is the way to go. Look at how great this looks. There is much more control with multiple masks, and you can have around 100 material layers too. It does get a bit more expensive to add loads of material layers to a single material, so keep that in mind if you're worried about performance. I think that just about covers everything you'll need so that you can go and get started with material layers. Here is a finished render of the cabin scene for you to enjoy. Also, be sure to chuck us a follow here to get notified when new videos get released. And don't forget, there's also lots of written content on the website to help elevate your Toolbag 5 skills. But most of all, have fun. Cheerio, friends!